about my background. I was born and raised in Chicago to traditional Tiger parents. My mom came from a lineage of pageant queens, and my great-grandmother, my grandmother, all of my aunts, all of my family members on my mom's side were all pageant queens. And so she grew up as being this perfect daughter, and she had to be perfect for my grandmother, who was, even at the age of 60, she was still competing. And so she embodied this paramount of beauty. And on my father's side, and with my mom's side, she was born and raised in Manila in the Philippines. And so there's a saying called maarte. And so all of the women on my mom's side was very much, nose in the air and very prim and proper. And on my father's side, he was born in Delhi. And so in Delhi in India. And my grandfather on my dad's side was the ambassador to UNICEF. And so you have, on the one hand, this idea of perfection and beauty. And then on the other side, you have legacy, pride, and success for this strict upbringing that I had. And they model that very well with us growing up. And my grandfather, as the ambassador to UNICEF, he traveled to 23 countries, he spoke so many languages, and really infused this sense of hard work ethic to his children, and that to my father. And so my dad had this entrepreneurial zest to leave, and so both of my parents met in Chicago. And so early on, I knew I had this entrepreneurial flair. I always like to use Amy Chuya's term, Tiger parents, because it was that Asian legacy that I was grown up with, and being multicultural and being and having two religions growing up with. There was definitely opened your eyes to being very flexible and adaptable. And so I grew up very fast because things took a slight turn when I was 10 years old. And typical Asian culture, you're in ballet, you're in dance, you're in violin, I played the piano. So my brothers and I, when we would get together with our families, it would be consistently a performance. Who would outdo the other? We didn't really quite fit the box growing up in Chicago, obviously melting pot of cultures. We didn't really quite fit, we had a whole community of Filipinos, and we had a whole community of Indians, and so we stood out. And that was, that was interesting. Growing up in the city, we often thought we were Hispanic because we didn't really fit these proverbial boxes of what was common growing up in urban sprawl. Things kind of took a turn when my mom got sick when I was 10, and she was diagnosed with cancer. And that took our world completely in a different path. And I remember she got very sick, and she was battling cancer for about 6 years. And there were points where nothing was good enough for my mother. She was she was such a perfectionist. And my grandmother was a perfectionist, so her mom was a perfectionist. My great-grandmother was, and everything needed to be a certain way. And so growing up, I constantly yearned for her validation. And so whether it was bringing home trophies from our piano competitions or our ballet or our classical dancing, but to spark that joy in her, that smile in her face, was really something that I caught on to very early on. And same thing with my father. You know, the saying, you only bring home nothing less than an A, that was definitely the culture that we were brought up with. And so on the one hand, with my mom battling this disease, all we wanted to do was make her happy. And so we would be the entertainment at the nursing homes on the weekends, you know, showing off our trophies and to the nursing staff, and they would, you know, they would totally love our performances. And, you know, to just get that smile on her face was something that I craved, and it became this drive. A year after my mom passed away, we were starting to rebuild our lives and our building blocks. And I remember I was a junior in high school, and we were planning on meeting after school. And for some reason, DJ, he grew up having asthma, and he had horrible asthma. And so I remember DJ, when we were younger, he would have these asthma attacks, and my parents would have to rush him to the hospital. It was one of those things where he suffered a severe asthma attack, and he didn't have his inhaler, or actually the inhaler that he had wasn't working at the time. And so he collapsed with his friend, and they tried to revive him 3 times and they couldn't. And so that was a really big, that was probably my first point of adversity and resilience, that losing my brother to his asthma attack. And it happened on my youngest brother, Vinay's 12th birthday. And so the immense pain that it was to lose my brother, you know, on my other brother's birthday, it was it really put things in perspective as far as, you know, the drive that I wanted to have, and how I wanted to be there for my family. And so that was, I would probably say, one of the initial points of my drive growing up. And I was about 14 when she really got sick, and she spent most of her time then in the hospital. And so she ended her battle with cancer when I was 16, and during that time, you know, in our household with my father, traditional, strict Indian father, I had one of many roles. I had to be the perfect daughter. I was the only perfect daughter left in the house. I had to, you know, cook, clean, be there for my brothers, take care of all of the traditional household duties and the obligations. And so that put enormous pressure, not only to be perfect, look a certain way, but then also lead my life in this way to please my parents. And I remember it was senior year, and I had applied to all of these schools, and, you know, I so badly wanted to leave Chicago for the first time and actually gain some sort of independence. And there was no way I could leave. And so DJ's death was really, it was a big blow to not only my father's psyche, you know, losing my mom the year before and losing my brother, it just kind of turned things into a very interesting time for our family. And so there was absolutely no way I could leave. I got into all of my dream schools, and, you know, I needed to be perfect for my family, and I needed to take on this responsibility to take care of my family. I needed to be there and be this mom for my youngest brother, Vinay. There was a lot of friction, and there was a lot of rebellion on my end, and it was this idea of, well, I didn't sign up to be a mom. I didn't sign up to work 3 jobs and cook and clean and be my dad's, you know, wife, so to speak, and, you know, do all the duties that my mom would. And so that put such a really big, extraordinary pressures on me as far as this internal struggle. And so the journey continued, and my dad, we definitely had our times where we didn't get along, because he was also the perfect son, and he also wanted me to live onto this path of legacy and pride and success. And so this walk lasted about finally regaining the strength and overcoming his depression that he was going through after the losses. And we were having this family wedding that we were going to, and my dad at this time, he had stopped smoking. He was jogging about 6 miles a day. He was finally even starting to date again. And so my brother Vinny and I thought it would be really interesting to dye his hair, and he had a silver gray hair, and we thought we would dye his hair slick black for our family wedding that we were going to attend for the first time. And he experienced a horrible reaction to the dye, and that sent him to the emergency room. And they did all these tests. I mean, he blew up like a big puffer fish. And they did all these routine tests, and there was something in the pit of my stomach when I had gone after spending many years watching my mom undergo cancer. And there's this feeling in my stomach that I felt. It was really, the lessons of adversity, and it was really the lessons of the losses, and not only losing to spontaneous loss, but also watching parents also succumb to diseases as well, and then being able to have this insatiable drive to live on your parents' legacy. And so with all of the upbringing that I had from this very strict Asian background of perfection, pride, legacy, and ego, it really fueled this momentum of, okay, how am I going to live beyond this, and how am I going to take my little brother and really chart past this for my family, our family, and our family name. And so that was kind of this seed that was planted in my head. And so marrying what society expected of me, and never really focusing on myself. And this kind of showed up in a lot of the love relationships that I had. And so for most of the time, all I wanted was to create a family that I lost. And so it really showed up in relationships. And so over a period of time, I would consistently overlap my dating and overlap the people that I was with, and overlap my relationships for fear of being alone. And for fear of really living into the grief. And so I would constantly distract myself, and I was constantly working. I was working 3 jobs, and I had it was the rigor of medical dental school, and then afterwards this drive to begin your own practice. And during this time, I met my ex-husband, and so he was also the perfect son, and he came from a family of very much pride, legacy, was a driving force. And so it was a very tumultuous relationship, and I think the turning point for me was our relationship was based off of pride, ego, this life. And then I realized, wait a minute, this was the life of my parents. They had this life and I was only living their life. And when is it that I will actually live my life? And so, it was the fancy cars, it was the first class travel, it was a 6-figure wedding, it was all of these, picture perfect things, but it really wasn't me. And that was when I decided that, walking away from the marriage, walking away from being this ideal perfect daughter, walking away from being, trying to be the perfect wife. And of course, along with all of that comes, violence and ego and just emptiness, and the emptiness that you have that comes in relationships. But then you realize you also attracted that person as well. And a lot of times we have people that come into our lives that, teach us different lessons for various, in various parts of our journey. And I think that that experience really then catapulted me into leadership and what that really looks like, because there was a point in time where I was living out of my car. I was essentially homeless. I was so afraid, and I was living by fear of what society would look like, fear of what that I would be leaving my marriage, fear that I was living in an abusive marriage, that I was being abused, and what people would think. And because divorce is so taboo in the Asian culture, especially the Indian and Filipino culture, where in the Philippines you don't even talk about divorce. And so this was the lie that I was living. And even though everything looked picture perfect on the outside, I was suffering in pain on the inside. And it wasn't until a dear friend of mine one day asked me, Neetha, are you happy? And when she asked me this, she already knew the answer, to which she just said, you don't have to be living this way. You can very well make a decision to leave, or to shove everything under a rug and live on just like so many other people do, and be living in fear. And so that's when I realized that it was time to leave. You hit complete rock bottom, but sometimes our biggest pain points in our life is our biggest blessings. And so from that point, obviously there was a lot of growth. And I'm not going to get into all of the details, but for anyone that's been through a very tumultuous divorce, there's definitely a lot of pain that goes along with that. And I think for me, that really catapulted intense growth in my leadership, not being afraid of what other people would think, and not being afraid that, oh my gosh, she was this big cosmetic dentist with a high profile practice. And so really living on your truth, and that's authenticity. And that was what authenticity really meant to me, is really completely stripping yourself completely naked, and living who you actually are. And that's when I realized everything completely changed, from my business life, from my personal life, to everything that I was doing as a result, and all the projects that really fueled this intense passion and this insatiable growth of really embarking on self-discovery and curiosity. Really living on our truth, and really living an authentic life. But really we don't understand that until we invest in believing in ourselves, and we invest in emotional intelligence. And this whole idea of self-love, and this whole idea of this walk that I've had with the journey of tons of different development over 150K in, in all of these different networks that I had built then, because it was this drive of, for the first time, I'm not thinking inside the box as this doctor being validated by these answers. And, the world then became this oyster of being able to understand the lens of human dynamics. And I was a psychology major in school, and so one of the big things that fascinated me throughout my studies was always human drivers of behavior and how we can use connection to really influence behavior. And coming from the background of being a healthcare professional, from that lens, no one wanted to see a dentist. I think that it was one of those things where, they're completely terrified. And so I learned early on how to utilize, principles of psychology to really kind of thwart behavior change in people, and that then became this drive to do that in my consulting businesses, as well as in the speaking engagements, in the people and the teams that I then began to build. I started doing investing in women as well, and so fast forward to where all of these building blocks today has led me to is this idea that as professionals and, with all of the people that I have had opportunities to consult, whether it's been high-profile CEOs or, moms that have just had their first child, the common thread is the same, and it really is living within understanding and mastering your emotions and what meanings we attach to certain things. And how we just don't, from a cultural perspective, being Asian, that's not taught. When I used to share this with, my parents as a young girl, it was like, okay, go study, or go practice the piano. And so that was a thing. It was never let's talk about these emotions. How does that really affect you? And so then you grow up to be in this box consistently. And so for the first time, on this road, you then realize that, oh, okay, some of the greatest leaders of our time really make the time for reflection. They make the time for thinking and understanding where these emotions come from. And, I share the story with people not to, not to gain pity, but it's to really understand from the lens of where I'm coming from. And we all have stories. And the point is not the story, but really the point is what you use from the story and how to affect your decisions. And your decisions, whether it's in relationship, whether it's in business, whether it's in interpersonal relationships, and most importantly, yourself. And I think that when we're more self-aware, we can then begin to make better decisions as humans.